Some ideas have little impact on our lives. Others redefine how we lead. I'm Willie Pietersen, former CEO, now Columbia professor and author of Leadership, The Inside Story. This is Ideas That Matter.
Welcome to Ideas That Matter with Professor Willie Pietersen. There's no shortage of ideas. This show is about the ones that hold up and the leadership it takes to make them work. Today's episode is not about strategy as theory. It's about strategy as something you have to live, lead, and execute inside a real organization. What they struggle with is why change efforts stall, why alignment breaks down, and why even good strategies fail to produce lasting results. Because the truth is, most leaders already know change is necessary. In this session, Professor Willie Pietersen walks us through a practical framework for leading change that actually works. He starts with a simple but powerful idea. Strategy is not a plan. It's a set of choices about where to focus and how to win. But making the right choices is only the beginning. Execution isn't just technical, it's emotional. People need clarity. They need belief. They need to understand where the organization is going, why it matters, and what it means for them. From there, Willie takes us deeper into the psychology of change, the resistance that naturally shows up, and the conditions required to move people forward. And ultimately, he lands on something every leader needs to hear. In a world that keeps shifting, strategy cannot be static. It has to be a living process, one that continuously learns, adapts, and aligns people, priorities, and execution. So as you listen, hold on to this idea. Strategy does not create results on its own. Results happen when strategy is understood, believed, acted on, and continuously improved. So let's get into it. Willie, welcome to the presentation today.
Thank you, Ted. Pleasure to be here.
You have no small task. Every leader knows that change is absolutely, the velocity and the scope is increasing. It's a full-time job now, being able to predict and reason through a strategy and ways to help people. So I don't envy you in your task, but I admire everything that you have done, and I'm looking forward to everything that you have to present today.
Well, great. Thank you, Ted. Well, let me take you through these ideas, and then let's open up for a discussion. And you can probe and ask any questions that you wish, so we learn together. Let's start with the agenda here. I have two objectives in mind in dealing with this. The first is to understand the main barriers to effective leadership of change. Now, that's the diagnostic aspect of this. Some of those barriers are kind of hidden and obscure, and we need to really reveal them in order to proceed from there. And then provide a set of ideas and practical tools to overcome these obstacles and thereby achieve success. Now, typically, there are two kinds of barriers we encounter. The first type of barrier is purely operational. And that is when we're trying to do something totally new by way of innovation or a new strategy, we need to rearrange all the operating aspects of our business system and align these behind the new strategy. There's kind of a deliberate, intentional way of doing that rather than trying to do them piecemeal as we go along, so we bump into problems. So that's the first thing we need to do. That's the first type of barrier we need to overcome. The second type of barrier is psychological. And that is to deal with the tendency, it's a human tendency, as you've said, Ted, for people to resist change, to do things that are unfamiliar to them, that present a set of threats, if you like, or a sense of loss, from certainty to a position of uncertainty. So those are the two aspects I think we need to contend with here. Now, the main thing when we think about change is that we need to understand what it is we are changing. And essentially what we're doing is pursuing a new set of strategic objectives. Now, that introduces a requirement for us to understand the critical drivers of a successful strategy. So, well, we need to have a new strategy here, a new set of goals. But in order to do that well, we first need to understand what strategy is and how it works most effectively. Now, here's Michael Porter. I'm sure well known to most of the listeners here, with a warning, if you like. And here's what he said. He's the basic thought leader in the whole realm of strategic thinking. But he makes the point here that strategic thinking is not something we are born with. It's a learned skill. Strategic thinking rarely occurs spontaneously, he said. And we need to have guidelines. And without those guidelines, very few managers know what constitutes strategic thinking. So let's think about those fundamental guidelines that inform strategic thinking and strategic functioning. So the essence of strategy, just a quick summary, and then we move on from here. The starting point here for understanding strategy is that there is only one reason we need to have a strategy in the first place. And if that reason didn't exist, we wouldn't need to have a strategy. And that reason is the inescapable reality of limited resources. You just think about that for a minute. If we had unlimited resources, which is actually a fantasy because it doesn't exist anywhere in the universe, in fact, the reality of life is we're always working with limited resources. But if we had that, just as a kind of a mind experiment, we had unlimited resources, well, imagine that. You could sit in an armchair and just throw resources at your problems and issues all the time. You'd never run out of resources. It'd be impossible to lose. You needn't worry about competitors, and risk-taking would become irrelevant. Now, that's a fantasy. We all live with the reality of limited resources. Think of the game of chess as an example. I'm not a chess player, but if I go to a chess tournament, I can walk around and I observe what's going on, and I can point at people and say, you've lost, you're losing, and they say, how do you know that? So, well, you've run out of resources, or your resources are trapped, and you can't move them. Now, chess is a game, so we are given equal resources. Everybody's got the same number of pieces. In real life, of course, there's asymmetry. We don't all have the same resources, and we have to really use our imagination, our innovative drive in order to outperform competitors. So what does this really introduce now in terms of a flow of logic? It means that strategy is about making choices on how to focus our scarce resources to achieve competitive advantage. It has to deliver specific outcomes. And those outcomes are a response to three very simple questions. But without answers to these three questions, we can't claim to have a strategy. Here they are. Who do we seek to serve, and what will we offer them? That's the first level of choice making. In a way, it defines the game we wish to play. Is it ice hockey? Is it American football? Is it English cricket? What is it? You can't define how you're going to win until you've defined where you wish to play. Second question, which builds on the first one, is what will be our winning proposition? And I'll come back to that in a minute. A winning proposition, strategies about winning. And the third one is what will be our key priorities for success. The very few things we need to do in order to realize our winning proposition. So that's the essence of strategy in a very, very stark summary. But the point I want to make here is that unless we have clear answers to these three questions, the organization won't know what to do. So the idea I'm offering here is that these three questions serve as a kind of a rallying point, around which an organization should make all of its decisions and define all of its activities. So that's the key thing. Here it is laid out for us, the three elements of choice making, the three critical strategic choices, our competitive focus, our winning proposition, and our key priorities. A couple of observations I'd like to make at this point. First of all, I put an emphasis on the phrase winning proposition. Everything about strategy is comparative. The whole idea is to create a margin of difference which gives your customers a compelling reason to choose you. That's the key differentiating point. So I ask my listeners always to abandon the idea of a value proposition, which is not a competitive statement at all because it's not comparative. It's a bit like saying, what's the weather going to be like today? And we say, well, we're going to have temperature. We say, oh, I know that already, but is it high, medium, or low? The same thing about a winning proposition. It's the margin of difference that matters in terms of competing effectively. Now, you'd see two yellow bubbles there. First one says, if you do this, create a good winning proposition and galvanize your organization behind it, you create greater customer value. You attract more customers, and they're willing to pay you more. And then on the left-hand side, you see superior profits. The point I want to make here is these two things are interdependent. The greater customer value you create, the more profits you will make, provided you do this efficiently. Now, the remaining thing is the key priorities, a few things that will make the difference, biggest difference to the outcome that we seek. Now, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples quickly of what I mean by winning proposition. These are very simple ones that are in the public domain, so I'm not giving away any confidential information about companies that I happen to be working with as a consultant. Let's just take two examples quickly. The first one is Amazon, hugely successful organization. And I'm quoting the words of Jeff Bezos here, and I'm reading from it. And his winning proposition is we make it easy for people to buy things. Think about that just for a minute. You don't have to run around from store to store. Sometimes the item is out of stock, or you find it and it's, they don't have your size. And you can do this whenever you wish, at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. It's a powerful, galvanizing idea on its own. But then he elaborates on it by offering a wide range of products at great prices with fast delivery. And therein lies the magic. Just note one thing. Amazon doesn't sell a single unique product. You can buy the same product at your mass merchandiser wherever you may live, Walmart or wherever else. The real essence of their winning proposition lies in their service model, which is often the magic that creates that margin of difference. But the whole organization is focused on those things. A wide range of products, great prices, fast delivery. End result, we make it easy for people to buy things. Galvanizing central idea. The next example I'd like to offer is Google. And here I'm talking about their search business. And I'll read how they define their winning game. We organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. More and more now, of course, they're using artificial intelligence to deliver those things. But note, there are 3 words here that sum it all up. Organize the world's information is number 1, because it comes in a mess, a whole, like a torrent of information, but structuring it in a way that makes it easy for us to begin our exploration. And then accessibility. Not 15 clicks to get there, but very quick access and make it useful. That's the ultimate benefit. Now, notice here, the whole organization is dedicated to doing those three things: organizing it, making it accessible, and making it useful. And if they're not making a contribution to those three things, they're really not adding any value for the organization. So just a few examples here in terms of what I mean by a winning proposition. Well, the point here now, this is a point of departure, if you like. And I've just covered the issue of the essence of strategy and the key deliverables we need to have in order to galvanize our organization behind any new strategy. And I think the point of emphasis here that I'd like to underline is that strategy creation and strategy implementation are interdependent. If you don't have a clear strategy, you're simply confusing your organization, and no amount of implementation effort can save you. Confusion is not a good starting point for doing a change endeavor. Okay, so with the assumption now that we have that kind of clarity, let's think about the implementation journey. And the important point I want to make it is a journey, taking us from the current state to some defined future state, which is the new strategy, defining those three things that might have changed in response to changing conditions externally. And we take the organization through the transition state. And that's what I'd like to talk about, because this is a rough period. It's unstable. It's stressful to people. It's uncertain in its outcome, but of course it's critically important. And it is a journey. It's not an event. Sometimes there's an illusion that we just hold a town hall meeting, make a brilliant speech about the new strategy, but the job is done, and everybody would rush off and do what's necessary to implement the change. Well, that's not the way it works. If it did, you could just write an email, sit at home, and expect the organization to do what you ask it to do. It's not a set of instructions. It's galvanizing energy, commitment, and the courage to take bold steps along the way. It's a bit like the Japanese. They have this slogan when they're trying to do something difficult, going through a tough transition: fall down 7 times, get up 8. So that's what's involved in this journey. It's a bit like a shepherd taking the flock through this difficult terrain. Now, here's some of the common causes of implementation failure. Let's start here and bring them into our kind of deliberate way of thinking, our intentional way of approaching this. First big mistake we tend to make is waiting too long. The world won't stop for us. It keeps changing. And competitors are not going to wait for us to act. They might act promptly, and then we become laggards. So the key here is to understand that typically the biggest cause of failure is the way we deal with success. So there's no such thing as a non-decision, because doing nothing has its own consequences that are sometimes even more important and dramatic than taking an active decision. So the cost of doing nothing is not nothing, and we need to act promptly. Second problem we encounter is when the framing of the challenge is unclear to people. Now, this is a critical leadership requirement here. Based on the strategy, if you've got these 3 outcomes, we can then frame the challenge that lies before us. I'll give you a quick example of an organization that failed because of a poor framing of the challenge, and that is General Motors. Now, General Motors, of course, was a vastly successful organization. It had over 50% of the U.S. auto market. And then with the entry of the Japanese competitors, Toyota, Honda, etc., it began to lose market share. It decided that its problem was a cost problem, and then embarked on a whole program of cost reduction. And every time the volume went down, they reduced the cost even further to match the new reduced volume. And it kept going down that way as their market share declined, and a kind of a race to the bottom. And they eventually went bankrupt, having been the largest company in the world at one stage, the most valuable company in the world. It went bankrupt, had to be rescued by the US government. What was their real problem? It was a quality problem. People didn't like their products and preferred the Japanese products. You don't solve that by cost cutting. It's a bit like a patient diagnosed with a kidney problem, and then the doctor applying a program to cure the liver. So framing the challenge was unclear. Third one is failure to inspire the support and sponsorship required. Now, we tend to think of the people below us, if we're senior people, to get everybody to support it. We think of laterally of people, in other functions that need to be brought together in a kind of an orchestrated effort. We seldom think about those above us. Our boss, the chairman of the organization, the board of directors, need to be visibly in support of the change. Because when people are fearful of change, they tend to look beyond the immediate leadership and wonder whether the top leadership are in support of it, a critical thing for us to attend to. The fourth one is to model the change personally. Now, here I can quote Gandhi, great Indian leader, who said, we need to be the change we wish to institute. We need to model it. Totally authentic, kind of sincere way. And the fifth one that can be crippling is trying to do too much at the same time. And this is the corporate sin that was committed by General Electric. It became a sprawling conglomerate, and eventually it was no more valuable than the sum of its parts. And the market had a look at this, and they lost $500 billion in market value, and then began to spin off various businesses, left themselves only with aerospace. And here's the stunning factor. If you now look at all of these independent pieces that used to be in one company together, the independent pieces are 5 times more valuable than they were when they were within the GE sprawling conglomerate. Incredible release of value that was trapped inside the organization because they were trying to do too much and confuse themselves. So those are the 5 I would point out for us to really pay attention to. Now, here's the next element. I talked about the psychological factors at the start. I quote Henry Kissinger here, is no strategy, he said, no matter how clever it might be, has any chance of succeeding if it's born in the minds of a few and carried in the hearts of none. Now, what does this actually mean for us? Well, for me, it means that the ultimate deliverable of a strategy is not just a document. It's a leadership message. Now, people don't follow documents. They follow leaders and they follow ideas. And we need to translate our strategy from a document into a compelling leadership message that wins the hearts and minds of our employees. Now, George Bernard Shaw made a quote about communication. And he said, the trouble with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. Now, it sounds like a whimsical kind of typical British comment to make, but what's he getting at here? I think there are 2 things that cause a failure in communication. The first is that you don't tune in to what your employees need to hear for them to be motivated. And the second is that you believe that communication is an event, but it's not an event, it's a campaign. Now, tuning in to, as a first order of business, what are the questions in the minds of employees? So let's talk about tuning in to what employees truly care about in our communications. The three things, I believe. First question always in the minds of employees: what are we aiming to achieve? And why should I care? Now, what we're aiming to achieve should be captured in those three critical deliverables. Who do we seek to serve? How will we win the competition for value creation? What will be our key priorities? And if these shift, we need to be clear about what they are and make people care, because they feel that they're dedicated to a cause larger than themselves, with an opportunity to make a difference to the outcome. Second question we need to answer is, for each of them, they all work in different functions. Where does my department fit in? And what exactly is expected of me? So it's no good giving just a corporate-wide new strategy. We need to go through function by function by function. This is how it works for you. This is where you fit in. This is where you make a difference. This is what's expected of each one of us independently. And the third is, how will we measure success? And what's in it for me? So we don't want to just go to a town hall meeting full of suspense. Is this working? Is it not working? We need to have transparent measures that are regularly shown to employees so they can see for themselves where we're falling short, where we're ahead, and what needs to be done. And what's in it for me question is seldom money. It's really having meaning in their work. As I said, the meaning is created from a dedication to a cause larger than themselves and the ability to make a difference to the outcome. So we need to be great storytellers as leaders, to take the strategy and convert it into a compelling story. Now, stories are magical in many ways, and I'm not talking about just standing up and, entertaining people. I'm talking about talking about the strategy in a way that you use metaphors, examples, etc. Strip down the complexity, make it as simple as possible. And I think there are 5 great features that we need to employ here when we tell great stories. The first job of a story is to simplify complexity. That's what a story does. And simplification is attention getting. That's the key. Second is they engage people not just intellectually, but also emotionally through vivid examples, metaphors, pictures. Great stories raise and then resolve an issue. That's why we go to the theater or watch a movie. It raises an issue and then resolves it in some kind of way. A great story does the same thing. The fourth is the call to action should be clearly framed. When we hear a good story like that, it should be incentivize us to do something about it. And then finally, of course, the story has to be genuine. The storyteller must embody the message. It's not something you just borrow from somebody and retell. I'll give you a quick example. Bill Clinton tells the story about when he was president and confronted maybe with a major issue to be solved, that he would call in his senior team and they would sit around the table in the Oval Office. And he says that very often these meetings would descend into a dysfunction, backstabbing, personal agendas, people losing the plot in terms of going into side issues, etc. And then he would stop them and say, please stop. I want you to focus on this issue. We need to solve it for the American people. Concentrate on the issue and work together to create a solution. And that he said, soon again, the meeting descended into a dysfunctional state. So we thought about addressing this. And he called up NASA, the people who send rockets into space, and literally said to them, look, folks, you went to the moon. Yes, sir, we did. And he said, and you brought back some moon rocks. Yes, we did. He said, please send me one. Don't send me a 2-ton thing. It's something I want to put in the center table in the Oval Office. And they sent him a moon rock. He put this moon rock on the table. He said nothing to anybody. The next meeting, when it descended into a dysfunctional state again, he said, stop. See that rock? It's 3.5 billion years old. And we're just passing through for a brief moment. Make a difference. And he said it worked every time. I love that story because it's so creative as a way to get people to understand. We have very short lives. In times of responsibility, we get given a short period of time to make a difference, but we have just enough time to do it. We don't have forever. We don't have 3.5 billion years. Well, a great example, I think, of using a metaphor in order to make a crucial point. Now, what I want to do now is to offer you a practical formula for leading change. And it's based on a flow of logic that comes from psychology. And it goes as follows. Why do we resist change in the first place? Well, to change is to suffer loss. And the loss of certainty, if you like, a loss of control. And this is the source of resistance typically. We don't resist change. We resist being changed. Loss of agency is a major factor here. So how do we overcome that? So to embrace change, people must be convinced that the gain is greater than this perceived loss. Kind of a psychological gain-loss analysis, if you like. And therefore, the driving forces must be greater than the restraining forces. Okay, well, that's fine in terms of psychological logic, but let's put into practice with a formula. Now, this formula has actually been tested pretty thoroughly, and it's worked pretty well because it's a fantastic diagnostic tool. Here's how it works. D multiplied by V multiplied by P must be greater than C. Now, of course, we don't think in terms of symbols. We think in terms of words and ideas. So let's translate. D is dissatisfaction with the current state. Unless there is dissatisfaction with the current state, the organization and its employees will not move. That's the first order of business. V is a clear vision for change. It's what I call your winning proposition that helps you succeed in the future. And P is a process for getting it done. All of these, when you multiply them, need in the minds of employees to be greater than the perceived cost of change. Now, just a quick word about each of them. You can't tell people, thinking about the D, you can't tell people to be dissatisfied. You can't just tell them a scary story. If we don't move, this or that will happen. They need to discover it themselves through a kind of a participative process. And I'll talk in a minute about how to do a situation analysis involving employees so they discover the truth of the current situation and the future threats for themselves. And then they are dedicated to doing it and they have ownership. Clear vision for change, that's the winning proposition. Talked about that. It's not a value proposition, it's a winning proposition. And that's very motivating. When I think about the process for getting it done, I think in very simple terms. First, you have to reorganize all of the elements of your business system. And then in terms of getting into action, I really like the idea of taking the 3 to 4 key priorities and creating teams, what I call gap teams, to close the gaps between the present state and a future state. And the trick here is not to start with a defined present state and then define the milestones that get you to the future state. You start with the end in mind. You start with the future state, make it measurable, then come and define, and in a measurable way, the present state, and divide it into milestones. And as Virginia Rometty, who's the chairman of IBM, has said, celebrate progress, not perfection. That's the idea of the progress for getting it done. Here's what happens when one of these is missing. If the D is missing, there's no felt need for change, and the organization won't move. If the V is missing, there's anxiety and confusion. And of course, if the P is missing, there's no kind of real strong process for getting the job done. There's frustration and rejection of change. Now, there's one final job to be done here. All of what I've offered so far offers us a way to go from a present state to a future state. The difficulty we have is that the future state is not a fixed point. The external environment is constantly changing, and we need to adapt. So we need to build an adaptive learning system that enable us not just to win, but to go on winning as the environment changes. So I'm going to offer you this new role of strategy. I've called Inventing the Role of Strategy. The old static methods, basically they're planning methods, creating strategy no longer work. The survival imperative is purely Darwinian. It's an organizational process to learn and adapt as the environment changes. Now, the great military strategist Karl von Clausewitz defined this beautifully. Of course, this is a translation from the German, but he wrote a book in 1832 and said in it that strategy is not so much what we have thought, but how we have thought it. And he said, we need a philosophy of strategy that contains the seeds of its constant rejuvenation, a way to chart strategy in an unstable environment. Now, how well have we done as an adaptive system in organizations? Well, the scorecard is not very impressive. In 1958, average life expectation, or the lifespan of organizations in the S&P 500 was 61 years. Today, it's 18 years. We are not doing well at creating adaptive systems. We need to up our game, and for this we need a method. Again, it comes back to a practical method, not just pure exhortation, running around telling people, please, you've got to learn, you've got to adapt. You've got to give them a method to get it done. So, again, we start with the end in mind in designing a process like this. There's a set of sequential steps for creating an adaptive process. Step one is external. What are our customers' needs and the key features of the market in which we have chosen to compete for advantage? That's the situation analysis that I was talking about in the DBP. This enables us to understand our challenge that we need to confront. Then, what is our key challenge and what will be our competitive focus, winning proposition, and key priorities? It all starts with an intelligence system, which is the first step. Third one, how will we align our business system and inspire our people to achieve superior execution? Now, this is largely what we've covered. But the final step here in a learning system is how do we continue to learn and adapt as the environment changes? It really is the Darwinian imperative here, or adapt or die. So the lifespan of organizations is not a factor of its age. It's a factor of their adaptive capacity. So briefly, here is the process. It's called strategic learning. It has 4 steps: learn, focus, align, and execute, and then a learning loop. Back to learn. We learn through a situation analysis. Examine the external environment, needs of customers, actions of competitors. And that enables us, with those insights, to define our focus, which is our strategic choices. Who do we seek to serve? How will we win? What will be our priorities? These are informed by the quality of the situation analysis, which is our intelligence system, just like it is in national security affairs or in the military. It's the intelligence system that guides all our strategic actions. And then the align system, as you can see there, all the elements of our business system need to combine together in support of the new strategy. Then we implement the strategy and experiment, try out new things. And then the learning loop. And the learning loop is critically important. My rule of the road is every 3 years, a completely fresh situation analysis, so we don't get ourselves anchored in the prior ones. And then in the intervening years, a refresh. We would look at our prior situation analysis, ask what's changed, and then move through the cycle again to make sure we're constantly adaptive. And we have to remember, we have competitors. Competitors have a vote. And if we wait and they act, we can fall behind very rapidly. So the key thing, and I think I quote Jack Welch here, when the rate of change outside of the organization exceeds the rate of change inside an organization, then the end is near. So Ted, I've just walked through all of these elements to describe what I think is necessary for the effective leadership of change, demonstrating the interaction between clarity of strategy and effective implementation, and the need to be learning and adapting continuously, and a methodology to do that. So I'm happy now to answer any questions you might have, and we can enter into a discussion.
Okay. Yeah, Willie, I would like to thank you very much. This is a mountain of information. You've taken some very complex ideas and ways of work and simplified them greatly. I'd like to start by going back to the beginning of what you said initially, and you quoted, I believe, or paraphrased Jeff Bezos and said that we make things easy to buy, which in effect would be their purpose. And that's starting with the end, as you had mentioned here. So when you look at strategy and the change process, how would you advise business owners or business leaders in general to build that dissatisfaction with the current state by using the big purpose and business situation? Because many people will say, why did you just change my job? I knew how to do it. It was easy. Now you're making it much more difficult.
Yes. Well, of course, I would offer myself as a messenger of the dictator that exists outside the organization, not inside. What we need to do inside an organization is determined by the external factors that describe what it takes to win. Because the reality is that success happens outside the boundaries of our organization, not inside. So there's a dictator out there that determines what we need to do inside. So the key is outside in thinking, not inside out thinking. So the question, what should we do, goes nowhere, because customers don't care what we do. They care only about what they get. And the external market, if it's changing in terms of its structures and requirements, for example, in AI, and we say, well, what should we do? Again, that doesn't take us anywhere. Yeah, when it comes to AI, outside in thinking, again, I'm no expert. You're the expert there. But my philosophy on that, it requires outside in thinking. How will we win the game we wish to play? What are our key priorities? How can we harness AI as an enabler to achieve those outcomes? So it's not what can AI do, it's what can AI do in service of our strategy. So I would say outside in thinking and embedding the notion that what we need to do inside an organization is always determined by the external circumstances that frame the challenge we need to meet.
Okay. I'd like then to continue. You mentioned President Clinton saying, just make a difference, looking at the rock, the moon rock. How do you appeal to people to work in a new ideal of here's the change we have to implement to get to where we need to be collectively? How did you find, what do you suggest? How does an organization and a leader actually begin describing making a difference and making it important enough that people actually pick up the cause?
Well, let me tell a story that involves tribal wisdom, ancient African tribal wisdom. It involves imbuing a young child with the right attitude for future success. And in tribal life in ancient times, it was necessary to collect firewood at dusk to be able to cook food and keep the huts warm during the night. And young kids were taught to go out and be useful and collect firewood, and they were given guidance. Firewood that burns is brittle. Look first on the ground to see what's fallen down. Then look up, and if you see a branch without leaves, bend it, and if it cracks, that wood can burn, and bring back as many sticks as you can. And let's imagine a 10-year-old kid coming with an armful of sticks and saying, here's my contribution. And the elder saying, oh, my goodness, you've done very well. But the moment has arrived for the elder now to impart a very important lesson to the young kid of 10 years old that he would remember for the rest of his life. Tribal life is competitive in many ways, many competing tribes competing for resources, and unity builds strength. Now, the elder could say to the young child, you know, young man, I want to tell you something important that I hope you'll remember. Unity builds strength. Now, it's unlikely for a 10-year-old to get overexcited about that statement and run off and tell his pals. Instead of which, the elder used a story involving the child. The child came back and he said, well, you know, the elder said, well done, you've got a lot of sticks there. You've done a great job. Put them on the ground. Kid puts the sticks on the ground and the elder says, pick up one. He picks it up. The elder says, break it. And he breaks it. And the elder says, well done. Kid says, yes, I'm only 10. Pick up 3. Picks up 3. The elder says, break them. And the kid tries and says, I can't, you know, I'm only 10. You break them. The elder picks them up. Says, look, you know, I can't break them either. You see, sticks in a bundle are unbreakable. Now, that is kind of for me, it's kind of a classic example of how to imbue a critical, lifelong idea to the mind of a child through a story that illustrates the truth and involves the child in some kind of an experiment. And that's something that he will remember. I offered this story when I was consulting to the Girl Scouts of America. They have 113 separate councils, and their whole task there is to get them to act in unison, unity of action. And when they heard the story, they took little bundles of sticks tied with a ribbon and put them into every one of their conference rooms at the Edith Macy Center, which is their training center in upstate New York. So I offer that as a kind of example. I think that there are many of these, but I think that what leaders do is to use these kinds of examples or metaphors or stories to illustrate the truth and importance of what they're trying to convey.
So then I want to ask, there's so much here that I could ask about. I want to ask, many leaders and business owners constantly are balancing the risk of, do I act now or do I wait? Because timing is so important. I could create a great product, but I'm ahead of the time. my market just isn't ready for it. So how do I balance that out of I wait or do I start and do I go now?
Well, that in itself is a decision, Ted. I think, being very intentional about that. The sin is to wait because you don't know what to do and you can't make an effective decision. If you decide to wait for a good strategic reason, where timing is critically important, that's another matter. That's kind of one of the choices we make. But the default position most often is not we're waiting deliberately. It's that we're dithering and not making a proper decision. Now, one way to break through that logjam is to do an experiment. Because typically when people say, well, I don't know whether we should act now or not act now, the trick is to be like, the way science learns. You do an experiment to see if it works. And the value of an experiment is that the value of the learning is much bigger than the cost of failure. So do an experiment of that kind to see if it works. And that kind of is a kind of a proof of concept. And also it illustrates whether the timing is effective, yes or no. That's one way of, it's action learning. Not all great decisions are just based on a discussion and a kind of an analytical approach. I believe strongly in action learning. And that is what science does through a series of experiments. It's action learning. And it always is preceded by a great question, an hypothesis, and then a test. And that's one powerful way that we learn our way forward.
You mentioned in the common causes of implementation failure, number 4, the need to model the change personally. You mentioned the story and starting with the end in mind, creating the story that draws people in and I'm going to say excites their emotion, gets their imagination and spontaneity active. How does an owner actually model change personally? Because I believe many, and correct me if I'm wrong, many business owners and leaders that I've met were good, logical idea people. But getting them to change and model different behaviors was for other people to do. How do you get them involved so that they feel it and they have to begin to drive the change themselves?
Well, let's take 2 examples. One is ethical behavior. I think organizations that start to involve, like, I think this company that I'm trying to think of now that failed dramatically because of its unethical behavior, forgotten its name for a minute, is, the lack of ethics seldom happens in one giant jump from being ethical to suddenly being unethical. It typically starts with somebody just crossing the line slightly. Say, well, this is not very consequential. I just do this little thing and see if it works. It's not quite right, but I'm doing it. And yes, it works. So nobody noticed or didn't make a difference. Well, the regulators didn't notice. And then, of course, that gives you permission. You do the next one and you get this kind of a creeping process towards an unethical situation in an organization. It becomes infectious. Now, what a leader needs to do is to demonstrate that ethics has a red line and we never cross it, and the decisions are made accordingly, and to insist always the decisions that are made are not just legal, but also ethical in their conduct. And people see that and they follow that example. So that's one example I would give you of being the change you wish to create. The other is outside-in thinking. Inside-out thinking is the default situation. That's a natural way of thinking about things. Now, a great way for a leader constantly to model outside-in thinking is when confronted with an issue to start with saying, let's first decide how we will make a decision. Decide how to decide. And then say, let's start on the outside. What do you think customers are needing most importantly now? Have we done a Maslow's hierarchy of needs about customers? What do you think competitors are mainly trying to do to compete effectively, take our customers away? In what ways are these changes in the structure of the external environment changing what we need to do. And then let's bring it inside and decide what we do here. Now, if you do that regularly enough as a leader, unfailingly do it, you'll find that people will copy that within their own functions as well. Outside-in thinking. It's another way to model what needs to be done.
You mentioned, very interesting, that let's say that somebody makes a ethical exception. Something happens, the pressure builds. We know what we want to do, but the pressure builds now, and I've got to make this order, this series of orders, this client, whatever it is, I got to make them right because my month end is really dependent upon it. So I make an exception, then I make another exception, and before you know it, that friction that drives the exception turns into drift. So my strategy starts drifting into something else. How do you recommend and suggest an owner or a business leader repurpose strategy to get everything back on course so that they can get to that point B in the future they want to get to? What do they do? What are some tools that they might use that would help them repurpose, reframe that strategy and bring everybody back to the central focus again, that pivot point of strategy?
Yeah, that's a big one, Ted. I've a great love for philosophy, as I might have mentioned to you in our previous discussions. And I think the ultimate value of philosophy finds its way into our leadership approach as well. Because what we're constantly doing as we make decisions and we lead an organization is we respond to three questions. What's true and what's not true? What's important amongst all the things that are true? We separate the important from the unimportant to create priorities. And thirdly, what's right? Now, it's very simple to choose between right and wrong. These two polar opposites. Our teenage kids can do that very effectively. A big issue is choosing between right and right. And there we loop back to what's important. And when we think about what's right, I think we need to be very clear and explicit and transparent about what our ethical standards are. Because unless these are in some way codified and then acted upon, people find little bits of wiggle room and little gaps. We could say, well, that's not in our ethical standards. I can do this and do that. Quite often, for example, at the end of the year, there's pressure to sell and a big set of promotions that we sell, and that dresses up the volume for the entire year. But each quarter is very uneven. It's the final quarter that delivers 50% of the volume, for example. And then when we have an analyst meeting, we don't lay that out. We disguise it. We simply say, this is the total annual sale. And of course, quarter one the next year will pay the price because we've loaded up the pipelines, the distribution system. I just believe in telling the truth. So the type of business that we have has got a very uneven approach. And what happens in the fourth quarter is our competitors try and load up. If we don't load up as well, we're going to lose a lot of market share. So it's not divided into four equal quarters. We have this, so we disaggregate and tell people the truth. And don't play games with numbers. Nietzsche said, there are no facts. There are only interpretations. You can interpret facts in many different kind of ways. And I think just trying to find the truth in this, the moment you don't tell the truth externally to regulators or to analysts or to investors, people mistrust you internally. And they think you won't tell the truth to them either. It's kind of just one of those critically important things. It's what Marcus Aurelius called your command center, your set of governing principles that determine how you lead, and to be totally clear about it.
You mentioned about leadership right now. Why is strategy fundamentally about choices rather than ambition alone?
It's about choices because we have limited resources. It's an interesting thing. The moment we overlook that, all of our strategic thinking can get lost. For one thing, conglomerates are failing more and more in these days. I quoted GE as an example, a stunning example. In 2005, it was the most valuable company in the world. And this, because of its sprawling conglomerate thing, it lost its way. So the truth of the matter is, the more things you try and do, the less successful you will be at any of them. And that's what was beginning to happen in GE until it spun off its businesses and focused and concentrated. But it's an unforgiving truth about limited resources. I'll tell you one other thing about it. It also dictates how many priorities we should have. We often talk about having no more than 5 priorities. Well, the research by a guy called Nelson Cowan from Missouri University has illustrated in a compelling bit of research he did that the correct number is between 3 and 4, because people can't carry more than those in their heads at the same time and function effectively. So we've got to think about the nature of our limited resources. They are limited physical resources. There are limited human resources, and it's not just the number of people, it's what's inside them and their ability to carry a certain number of things in their heads and function effectively. And then there's limited time at our disposal, limited temporal resources. And we need to pay attention to all of those and concentrate our efforts accordingly.
Okay. Willie, I want to ask you one last question. It seems like this is the thing that brings everything together. And in one of your slides, you mentioned that the learning loop. How does an organization really know when it's learning and it's valuable learning, in effect? It's just not another idea or fighting a concept that you believe in and it has ego involved and things like that. How do you bring it back to facts that you can actually show to people? Here's why we need to change. We need to manage this. We have to make a difference, and we have to make it easy in some way for people to use and purchase our products. How do you know when you have a learning system in place?
Well, it's when it delivers results. So doing a situation analysis, which is your intelligence system, is not something that occurs naturally. I'm back to Michael Porter's statement that thinking strategically is not spontaneous. It's a learning process. It's a learned skill. And doing good intelligence work is difficult, as the military has illustrated over and over, with big mistakes that get made because of poor intelligence. So when we do a situation analysis, we look at customers, competitors, the external market, and our own realities, and determine the gap between what the external market requires of us and what we're actually doing now, and what our competencies are and what the competencies are to succeed. So this requires looking at a lot of data and extracting the insights from the data. So the question is, what's an insight? That really goes to the heart of what you're asking about. So I have a little test that I apply to people, and that is this. Think about getting an ounce of pure gold. You have to dig up 4 tons of gold ore to find 1 ounce of pure gold. We have to look at all of this information to find out that ounce of gold, extracting that fundamental truth that represents an insight. Now, what is an insight? What's the test we need to apply? An insight is an idea that arises, or a finding from the situation analysis, that if you applied it, would make a fundamental difference to your level of success. Otherwise, it's just wallpaper.
Willie, this has been another in a long line of fabulous and very interesting conversations. I want to thank you for your time and all the thought that you've put into this. And there's so many gold nuggets here that we could still harvest. But I want to thank you for your time, a very interesting conversation, and a very good learning experience for a business leader and owner, and helping their business move forward in a period of fierce change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. It's been my pleasure. Hi, I'm Willie Pietersen. Leadership is not about wielding power. It's about authenticity and inspiring others to achieve a shared purpose. Excelling as a leader is a continuous journey of pursuing ideas that matter as the environment shifts and new challenges emerge. Thank you for watching. Please share your ideas by leaving your comments below. We learn best when we learn together. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Thank you again.